Hey, Bastish Beer for 64K, and welcome to another video special. And welcome back. So in today's special, we're going to be having a look at Atarisoft, for the most part, a very short-lived subdivision of Atari themselves, who produced a lot of arcade conversions to the Commodore 64 in the mid-80s. But first, let's get a little bit of context here and find out a little bit more about Atarisoft. Atarisoft was set up as a new brand name for Atari Incorporated. Their goal was to simply publish games, mainly arcade games, for non-Atari consoles or computers. These games all hit up popular systems at the time, and were specifically color-coded for the system they came out for. C64 boxes were green, PC boxes were blue, Apple II were red, etc, etc. The brand was extremely successful, even though they only existed for 2 years, as in 1984 Warner Communications sold Atari to Jack Tramiel, and the sub-label brand was discontinued. Many more games were actually complete that essentially got shelved for multiple systems, although over the years some of these have been rediscovered, and we'll have a look at one of these examples at the end of the video. And now let's have a brief look at all the games we're going to look at today. All these games were released between 1983 and 1984. 83 gave us Battlezone, Centipede, Defender, Dig Dug, Donkey Kong, Galaxian, Jungle Hunt, Moon Patrol, Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, and Robotron 2084, with 1984 also giving us Pole Position and finally Track and Field. All these were released on the Atarisoft label, although depending on your worldwide region and multiple licensing deals, they also got multiple releases on the C64, with companies such as Thunder Mountain, Atarisoft, Konami, and US Gold and more releasing versions of these same games as well. And we'll start the show with all the Atarisoft releases. Battlezone was released in the arcades in 1980 by Atari, a first-person vector graphics tank simulator. The C64 version was released in 1983. Considering the C64 version came out less than a year after the system's launch, it's fairly impressive. The game is very simple, just hunt down other tanks using your radar and blow them away before they get you. The game is all about racking up that big score, just like all old Atari games. The C64 handles the arcade pretty well, and it's got everything here, and you can drive all over the map, hunt down tanks and annihilate them, complemented by some pretty good sound effects. Vector graphics would be used later to much more impressive effect on this computer, but even so, this bare bones arcade port is a competent version of a then cutting edge arcade game. Next was Centipede, Atari's 1981 fixed screen shooter. The C64 version hit the system in 1983. It was a perfect fit for home computers at the time. Simplistic graphics and sound, but very addictive gameplay. The C64 port again was pretty spot on, easily capturing the look of the arcade, which was basically a variation on Space Invaders, as you had to blast and destroy a centipede making its way down the screen. If it managed to get to the bottom where you are, it's game over. The graphics are pretty simplistic, as were the arcades, with spot sound effects which the C64 has its own variations on, but it really plays well with a joystick, even though the original needed a trackball. You basically had a really good version of an arcade game at home on your Commodore 64 in 1983. Defender was a horizontal shoot-'em-up released by Williams in 1981. The C64 version came out in 83. This version is pretty faithful to the arcade, not quite as fast or smooth, but still solid. In the game you have to go back and forth across the world shooting aliens that are trying to pick up and abduct humans. Destroy all of them in a level and the wave ends. Each wave gets harder with new enemies and problems added to the gameplay. The graphics of the arcade and the C64 version are simplistic, but they work. The sound effects can never match the arcade's iconic sounds, but still are decent enough. The game's speed increases quite dramatically as the waves progress, but never reaches the arcade's level of flow. It's still another good, but not great conversion of this Williams classic. Galaxian was a fixed screen shooter released by Namco in 1979. The C64 version was an 83 release. This unfortunately is absolutely abysmal version of the arcade. So bad in fact that I always thought it was only a VIC-20 release, but alas it did get a C64 version officially that sports horrendous sound, slow and almost unresponsive gameplay, and the amount of graphical glitches going on make the game barely functional. It's the worst arcade conversion yet released through Atarisoft, and there's no reason why this game couldn't be pulled off quite easily. Just go and play any of the many clone games of this game on the system. they are 1,000 times better. Another Williams shoot-'em-up was Robotron 2084, released in 1982. The C64 version was released only a year later. It's a pretty decent version of the chaotic arcade game. This game is basically Defender on the ground. You run around blasting robots while rescuing hostages, with wave after wave increasing the difficulty and enemies encountered. The game is a little bit slower than the arcade, but still has the gameplay down pretty well. Despite the fact that the original was a twin-stick shooter, they managed to actually pull it off on the C64 version, and it plays well. It has good graphics that are quite close to the arcade, with some decent sound effects as well. If your character speed was a bit faster overall, this could have been a pretty close conversion, but it's still a very enjoyable conversion, and was in the home 1 year after the arcade's debut, which is quite impressive. Another Namco release was 1982's Dig Dug, with a rapid C64 conversion in 1983. The arcade was a maze-style game where you get to dig underground and kill all the creatures there to escape a level. The C64 conversion is very impressive. The way they managed to capture each aspect of the arcade so accurately is to be commended. The game has a colourful, vibrant look, and besides the aspect ratio, which makes everything look stretched out, it still looks like the arcade pretty accurately. The sound is also spot on, with the music, which is basically your footsteps, and the pump sounds all being very close to the original. And the gameplay is absolutely spot on. One of the best conversions published under the Atarisoft label. Nintendo's original platformer Donkey Kong hit the arcades in 1981, with this C64 version releasing in 83. You play Mario as you try to rescue a damsel from the top of the platform protected by Donkey Kong. This is another exceptionally well done conversion for 83, delivering the looks and sounds of the arcade extremely well. Just like Dig Dug, the graphics are stretched out for the home, obviously to compensate for the completely different video aspects of home versus arcades. It again looks very good with nice, colourful and animated graphics. The gameplay fits perfectly for a C64 joystick, and it has that little depressing tune in the background and loud, fun sound effects which really liven the whole game up. I used to load this one up quite a lot with Dig Dug back in the early days. It's just another Atarisoft hit. Next was Jungle Hunt, also known as Jungle King, hitting the arcades in 1982 by Taito, with a C64 port in 83. You play an adventurer in the side-scrolling action game that has you trying to rescue a girl before she gets eaten by a bunch of cannibals. The game has multiple levels, just like the arcade, with some vine swinging, some river stabbing, and boulder dodging before the final confrontation with the cannibals. I feel it complements the arcade quite well, with everything intact. The sound effects are a bit harsh, but okay overall. Graphics are also simple, but so were the arcades. But the variety overall makes it a pretty fun playthrough, and it's a decent conversion overall. Moon Patrol was next by RM, released in 82, with the C64 version hitting in 83. This was a classic side-scrolling game, as you try to survive a bunch of deadly zones filled with all kinds of criminals and take them out. Graphically, the C64 interpretation is ugly, but gameplay is surprisingly good, with all the jumps, shooting action translating over well. The background never changes, unlike the arcade, which is very disappointing, but all the other game's elements appear, like the tanks, the big rock slides, the minefields, and the massive jumps. And the sound is pretty good, with the arcade's addictive title track bopping along in the background. It could definitely be much better, but still, it's another competent arcade conversion. Pac-Man by Namco debuted in 1980. The maze action game got its C64 version in 1983. It's a pretty loose interpretation of the arcade game, much like Moon Patrol, with the basics of eating all the dots and completing each level intact. The aspect ratio is stretched, so it gives the game a different feel when you play it. Like the maze just feels way bigger than it really is. It's still visually quite nice, very clean, not exactly 100% copying the arcade, but more interpreting it. Sound effects are loud and proud, as per C64 standards. They maybe could have been toned down a bit. It's a bit of a weird conversion, but at the end of the day, it still plays really well, and that's really the most important factor. So I feel overall it's just another good Atarisoft job. Miss Pac-Man was next by Midway, released in 1982, with the C64 version in 1983. This is a completely different attempt at a conversion than they tried with Pac-Man, as they tried to replicate the arcade completely, and honestly managed to do it extremely well. The graphics are spot on, looking like the arcade and even some of the smallest details, which is very impressive. The sound is excellent, all replicated and sounding pretty authentic, and all the different maze structures and game speed as you move along gets crazy intense. For 1983, this This is an incredible conversion to have in your home. It's one of the best Atarisoft conversions they ever did for the C64. Pole Position was next, by Namco, released in 1982 and hitting the C64 in 1984. This game was a top-of-the-line Formula 1 racer back then and really pushed the racing genre ahead dramatically. The C64 version is a valiant attempt to do an arcade that was way ahead of what the C64 could do. It does manage to be fairly decent in the end. The graphics are big and chunky, which was the style for early C64 games, but still it works, and the car handling is very solid with nice sound effects for atmosphere. I think overall it does actually capture the arcade quite well and gives a pretty fun racing experience overall. And the final Atarisoft release was Track and Field, Konami's 1983 multi-event sports game, hitting the C64 in 1984. It's a very good arcade conversion, featuring all 6 of the arcade's events intact, and features the usual joystick destroying gameplay expected of these games back then. Visually it doesn't look as slick as the sequel, Hypersports, on the C64 due to the fact that, like I said earlier, they chunked up the graphics in typical early C64 style, but it still works, and the sound effects are simple but effective. Gameplay is very good, so you'll have a lot of time to master each event, and overall I think it's a much better game than most people remember, as Hypersports, the obvious superior sequel, usually always takes the limelight.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Atari themselves were in an absolute chaotic place in the mid-80s due to the video game crash and multiple other reasons. Many games that were actually completed were cancelled, and incomplete games were just thrown to the side. Fortunately, one last Atarisoft game was actually completed and recently discovered in 2020 on the Commodore 64. Here's that story. In 2020, we finally got to see the release of Joust on the Commodore 64, although not officially. The story goes the game was made and completed and was going to be released on the C64 in 1984 by Atarisoft. But everyone knows the video game crash hit and Atari was hit hard, hence the game never saw the light of day. But now, over 35 years later, you can finally play it thanks to Ken van Mersbergen, who in the first quarter of 2020 was busy converting some old discs of a retired programmer and discovered the Joust file on there, as well as the source code for the C64 version of Popeye, which was also an arcade conversion, which leads many people to believe that whoever did the Joust conversion may have worked on Popeye as well, although nobody has been able to confirm who did the actual work. With Joust's absence in the 80s, the C64 was graced with its fair share of clones to compensate or cash in on. One that springs to mind that is quite enjoyable is called Pegasus and is totally well worth checking out. But now you can actually try the real deal out for yourself. The conversion itself is very faithful to the arcade. Simple graphics, basic sound effects, just like its big brother, and it replicates it really well. Gameplay is also very close, as I was able to use the same techniques from the arcade version to plow through waves of nuts, and the creepy lava hand and the pterodactyl are all there as well. And I found that playing it in its hardest difficulty was way more fun and really makes the game shine. Overall, it's pretty good. It would have been cool though to have a rocking Sid tune playing during gameplay or even on the title screen, but then again it probably wouldn't make it the arcade. In retrospect, this would have been another great arcade conversion under Atarisoft's belt, much like Jungle Hunt or Moon Patrol, but at least we finally got to play it. The game is currently available to download for free from csdb.dk, and I'll leave a link in the description to it, so there's no reason not to try out this long lost gem. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time, and if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.